There we go. So the theme for today, as hopefully you've all realised, is planning. So we recently commissioned Planning Aid Wales to put a guide to planning for community-led housing developments together. Mark's going to be speaking about that for us, so I don't want to steal his thunder too much. But just to point out that the aim of our guide is to help groups understand, navigate and influence the planning system. It's not a how-to guide and by no means at all does it replace any national or local guidance documents and policies. But what we do hope is that it'll provide some clarity around how planning works and how you can potentially influence planning at a local level. We'll share an executive summary of that guide with you after the meeting. And the full version in both English and Welsh will hopefully be on our website by the end of next week. So we'll send out a link for that too. What I am going to ask in terms of question and answers later is if you can keep your questions broad for the benefit of everyone attending. Planning's a very specific technical subject and quite emotive as well. And of course, you know, we really welcome you contacting us about specific questions to do with your scheme, and we'll try and help you address those. Also with us today, we've got Francis and Mike, who will share their experiences of the award-winning Marmalade Lane co-housing development in Cambridgeshire, where I understand Francis is a resident there. So, but we'll also hear about their role with Town as well, which is an ethical developer who worked with Marmalade Lane residents to make that development a reality. Last but not least, we've got Keith Henson, who's a rural housing enabler covering Ceredigion. So he's going to share some of his experiences of development control meetings and appeals. And that will lead us nicely into some group discussions around the planning challenges that others may face. But what I'm going to do now is hand straight over to Mark Jones from Planning Aid Wales. So I think you should be able to share your screen, Mark. So hopefully that should be okay, but you're still on mute at the moment.
Can we see? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can see and hear you, so that's great. Thank you.
Good. Right. Okay. Hopefully this will work. If not, I'll go back to basics. Yeah, my name is Mark Jones. I'm Planning Engagement Officer with Planning Aid Wales. I'm a chartered town planner and have been for 31 years now, I think. And we've worked on private practice and previously in local government. So, I'm going to get this to move. There we go. I think just to bring everyone very quickly, just so you know who we are. As Claire's mentioned, Planning Aid Wales, we're working on their guide. Planning Aid Wales is an independent charity. We're different to Planning Aid England insofar as we're effectively divorced from the RTPI. We're a different organisation, and we're an independent charity whose primary focus is community engagement in planning. We aim to sort of encourage more engagement, get people to understand the process more. We are primarily and partially Welsh government funded, and we also then have a consultancy in inverted commas side, shall I say, where we do various projects such as this one. We provide impartial planning guidance and advice to local authorities in some cases, and we've worked on a few LDP engagement issues, significantly to the community and town councils and to individuals. We operate a helpline system for individual queries, and we do numerous training events and publication. Okay, to set the context very quickly, we were instructed by Wales Co-op to provide a guide on planning issues in relation to community-led housing. As Claire said, this was to identify and explain the current system and how you can engage within it and how the process works. There was nothing that we're looking to do to change national policy. At the present time in Wales, that's fairly unlikely. We have Ian in England. We have nothing along the lines of what is going on in England in relation to the white paper or potential planning reforms, and really not likely in the foreseeable future for Wales. The aim was to produce a relevant, easy to read and understandable guidance for community-led projects, just to give that, really to open the door to people to understand the process. We did engage, and part of our brief from Wales Co-op was to engage with some groups to find out where issues were and the understanding was. Part of this process was to increase the awareness amongst certain communities with regard to community-led housing, and to increase the capacity for those groups to make meaningful applications or representations if they're looking through the LDP process. Engagement, as with everybody else, the timing of our work was clearly impacted by COVID, so we didn't hold any face-to-face interviews. As I say, we did target telephone interviews. I think the answer, in the sense I haven't updated that because it did change. Most were done by Zoom, so we did have a number of group meetings with various groups who have an interest in community-led housing in Wales to seek their views of what they thought about the planning system, and I'll probably touch on that briefly in a second. So the key outputs from the engagement and the report was to review the existing planning guidance on community-led housing across England and Wales. I'll mention that simply because when we will come to example, the only reason England's there in a minute is related to case studies primarily. To raise aware of current planning procedures and the consideration of community-led housing through the planning process, and identify further support that might be required. Key parts that came out from the discussions we had with various groups was an understanding of the process and a frustration, and it's not an unusual comment from many people with the planning system. But so what we were hoping to achieve is to explain that maybe the planning system is not as complicated, or doesn't need to be as complicated as it can, and you can engage. And this is how local authorities are making decisions, or how you can influence. So that was our guide. There seemed to be, as I said, a little bit of a misunderstanding in some cases, which was built into, I don't think it's unfair to say, in a sense, some sort of resentment to the planning system that it's over what it was trying to achieve. So I think it was tried to enlighten and provide guidance to sort of say, well, it's not as bad as you might perceive, and if you can engage in certain ways, it can get a lot better. We also, at the end, our output will raise awareness of the guidance. That's the standard planning areas, how we approach things through our networks that we use. Just very briefly on the engagement, as I said, we had a number of interviews, meetings. We spoke, or we contacted a number of groups. The 5 that are listed above, we had engagement events and discussed. And community-led projects where we're looking at is quite a broad spectrum. And as you see, in some cases, it did come back of issues to be discussed in relation to one planet development. And there is a section within the guide on that, through to smaller co-housing schemes and even to the consideration of larger community housing schemes. So there was a broad spectrum, hence the group and the 5 people we spoke to there covered a whole multitude of issues in both urban and rural locations from a Welsh point of view. We carried out, as you can see, our engagement took place just as lockdown kicked in, or lockdown 1 kicked in, I should say, and we ran for a month. Format of which was to explain to people what we were doing, who we were. And again, it's a big asset for Planning Aid Wales that we often find a hurdle as we start these things, that people don't know who we are. And then once we've managed to explain that we are an independent, impartial group, people open up a lot more, and we find we can gain quite a bit more. A better analogy than even this guide is our work we do on LDPs, where we do community engagement, and we've certainly found in the last couple of years by talking to us, people have been much more willing to highlight their concerns and benefits. So that was a positive aspect for us. Purpose of the interviews we went through, and then we discussed, which was more open to the representatives who we spoke to. What were their issues? Where were the problems? And as I said, the key part they were coming forward is local authorities would look to resist development. There's no interest in engagement. They just want to tick boxes. It's all the standard things which I think we probably could throw against the planning system across the whole country. And as I said, working in private practice in England for 20 years, I could probably throw the same things, that I'd get the same comments from clients in that background as well. The emphasis being that we weren't changing current policy and procedures. I think that was a big hurdle. I think there was a lot of hope initially from respondents that that's what they wanted. This may be something that comes in the future, and certainly there are certain aspects of Welsh guidance which I think is fair to say is now fairly well dated and could do with at least an update, if not a complete rethink. But the important point was to get the message that our instruction was to produce a guide to help them navigate the current system, not to change the process completely. Okay, just looking at the guide, and very briefly, I'm conscious of time and questions, so very briefly, I've just picked the headings that we worked through. The guide is set out into various sections, so we explain what I've just said, the guide, explaining the planning system in Wales, again, an understanding from people there wasn't how it all fitted, so that we've got from an overarching document with planning policy Wales on national policy, filtering down to local development plans, down to supplementary planning guidance in Wales. We discussed the role of place plans, which is the Welsh equivalent of neighbourhood planning, albeit it doesn't have a statutory basis in the system. We touched on the NDF, which is probably not, which is the new, or the national plan, I should say now, I think it's going to be called, which is a broad strategic document, which will have no major significance. And the forthcoming regional guidance we're going to get in Wales with strategic development plan. So to explain how we're still very much a top-down system, and how the policies all fit in and how the system works, and then explaining the importance of the policy background in the decision-making process that will follow. We had a small section we're looking at acquiring sites and findings. It's a very basic, there's no facility within Wales that identifies particular sites, but we highlighted a number of examples that were coming to us from groups we spoke to, be it from the simple ones of looking through estate agents, others who've used candidate sites, others who've looked at the exception sites policy in Wales, rejected candidate sites as well on some grounds. So we've identified sources that people can explore. An issue that was raised to us, that Gall wanted us to look at is community housing was two different ways of looking. Is there conversion, refurbishment means? So again, we've included a section on conversion separately to looking at community housing as new build. Clearly conversion policy with a lot of queries, and again, as you can imagine, by a significant part of Wales is rural, a lot of rural buildings for conversion. People were looking at, again, when we come to one planet development, these are the key issues. So we explored the policies there of how buildings can come back into use and within the planning system, and maybe benefits, and also the disbenefits in some cases of conversion can lead to. We touched on community-led housing as new build. As I said, there's no specific guidance in relation really to community-led housing as a unique system in Wales. It's judged alongside everything else, but we discussed the process of promoting sites, if that was the way that was going along, through to making a sensible and a clear application for such schemes. The second section obviously follows that same thing. So we explained the planning process again. What we found, which is not surprising, and we find it elsewhere with community full understanding of how making a planning application works. What does the authority do? What do I need to submit? Should I consider this? And there was still a feeling, in some cases, we put the plans in and away we go. And again, so we've put a section to explain the planning system slightly more complex than that, and the work that's needed, the need potentially for other professional advice, particularly, as I said, I keep referring to the edge of rural sites, clearly, which throws up a range of ecological and historic farming contamination issues that they may need advice. They need advice from appropriate professionals, and the local authorities have been looking for this. So again, it's taking someone through. What we're looking at the guide is to take them through the process from filling an application form to the supporting information, validation lists, through to a decision, conditions, section 106 agreements. We've touched on SIL, although it's not really applicable. I mean, for a number of reasons. There's only 3 authorities in the whole of Wales that are actually got SIL charging schedules. I think they'll probably fade out in due course. But we did explain the process should the Welsh Government pursue community infrastructure levy in any greater detail. Finally, we had a section which is a real planning aid flag piece, is engage in the LDP process. We find quite a lot of times, not just with community-led housing, as I said, but with work we do with other communities, that this is almost ignored in the sense of we don't want to get involved in that. We only want when we get the application, and trying to explain the importance of positive planning policies, positive frameworks for development, that how the LDP process in Wales work, particularly at the moment as we have a significant authorities moving on to LDP2, reviews are taking place, that it is maybe a little time well spent to look what's coming out, trying to engage. If you're looking at particularly larger sites, if anybody had to sort of explaining that now's the time maybe to have discussions with the policy teams, as I said, quite a few authorities are at issues and options. We ended again, there's a big thing that came out is planning is full of jargon, so we've tried to include a glossary of as many planning terms we could think of, culminating with a further information. I think that was, we'll come to questions, that's coming slightly early. We always show this one, and what we've tried to slide is try to explain in the guide the importance links between planning, community and development, and the dotted lines is planning aid's interpretation of where these things start to break down. Our goal of planning aid and where we've tried to get within the current guide for community and land housing for the Wales Co-op is that these lines need to be more solid, that the 3 sides of the triangle coming together. They don't have to be fighting on every issue. They can come together and planning works well. Culminating with our view in community, as I said, this is our general view of planning, but it is particularly applicable to community-led housing. The importance from things like this guide going forward was increased understanding and an early and ongoing engagement in the process is going to lead to an increased influence and ultimately success for projects that community-led housing applicants are looking at. I think that's it for me, Claire, and that was just who we are at the end. From planning aid, I'll touch on one thing, sorry, because I remember Claire's note said what planning aid can offer. As I said, we do offer services and advice, so if anybody's looking at community-led housing schemes, we do have a helpline and we can offer general advice. We don't represent, we're not there to act as consultants, and we're not there to turn around and tell a local authority they've got it completely wrong. But we can certainly advise and provide guidance to people at the signposting on the process, procedures they're looking for, what they need to do. Indeed, I think we had a conversation with someone on the edge of Cardiff recently. So planning aid is a resource. You know, it is always worth contacting us. You know, we'll politely, if it is something that's beyond our remit, so we'll politely advise that, but hopefully point you in the direction of someone who can help. I think that's probably it for me, Claire, unless somebody, we now move on to questions. There are any? Is that okay?
So there were a couple of things brought up in the chat which may have been answered by your presentation as they went along.
Okay.
Does anyone have any questions for Mark? Tracy has her hand raised. Do you want to ask a question, Tracy?
Yes, I'm involved with an alternative proposal for a local development, and as you picked up, people don't understand the planning system after allocation of LTP areas, which has left us in a position with campaign at the end of it, which has been a very strong and active campaign. With what we would like to do is engage with the objectors post-decision, and because we feel we don't want to obstruct or annoy campaigners at this stage, but post-decision we'd like to form a place plan and engage with the objectors at that point. My question is, how do you engage with the community usually when there is objection in place?
Okay. It depends, is the honest. I suppose the bulk of our work through that type of example comes via the community town councils we tend to have, and we've certainly engaged in some things there. We act as effectively facilitators and negotiators between two parties, in the sense we don't take two sides, we don't take either side. I'm trying to think of the best way. In a sense, it depends when something's brought to us. We don't have a standard where we would go out and say, we see you've got a problem, can we help? If someone comes to us, and what we have tend to run forums, events, where we would lead the debate, so it doesn't end up, I've sat through many where we just have two sides shouting at each other across the room. And that's worked fairly successfully, because we've allowed people to air their grievances and their defences, and amazingly by the end of it brought people together that the differences weren't that far apart. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, in the sense as I said, we work on a case-by-case basis depending what's needed, but as a sort of facilitator to events from there. Is that the sort of thing you'll answer, Tracy, or you...
Well, we were looking to set a sort of post-decision, in effect. If the decision goes against objection for the objectors, then we were looking to link up with those objectors and inform. But it's largely, perhaps it's with the guide I get the answer, in as much as if this should happen again in the future in another area, then it's making people aware that that's, as soon as that LTP is allocated, exactly, how they can engage in that process. We've got quite a tricky path ahead of us, so to speak. And it might be a short-lived path if the objectors are granted, that no houses are built. But post decision, then we want to pick up those objectors, and we'd like to hold an event. So possibly if you come out to events, that would be great. It's a bit difficult with COVID. Are you engaging over Zoom? Can you arrange Zoom meetings, this sort of thing?
Yeah, certainly. We've done plenty of virtual, and in fact, all our work is currently done now virtual, as you'd expect. So we've all our training events, and we found that it's working quite successfully. I'll be perfectly honest, I think it's working better than it was when it was face to face. So yes, that's certainly something. I think, Tracy, without sort of too much detail, it's probably worth, as you said, if you've got the details, we can provide through through Claire our details. If you drop us a line, we could have a chat over the processes. I do wonder, in the sense you say post decisions, and sometimes, and again, I'm a little utopian in the sense is there is an element of some people, once it's post decision of it, oh well, it's done anyway, we're not going to bother. We lost. So I wouldn't rule out trying to engage before decisions. Is sometimes it can work out well. It can lead to two sides disagreeing, I know, but there can be benefits in trying to reach that sort of compromise and agreement in advance. But perhaps if you drop me a line, or drop us a line, then we could probably go through some detail exactly how we could help, Tracy. No problem.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. I think we've got just before we move on, Lydia's put something in the chat about the experience of people, possibly quite linked to some of what Tracy has said, really, about people coming quite late into the process to launch appeals against a planning application. Is that right? And we're just wondering if that's something Planning Aid monitor or respond to at all. Have I got that sort of query right?
Not quite. Some of our members have got concerns about property developers actually coming late, appealing late, and then the local authorities not challenging it because they're fairly pushed, as they all are nowadays, and they just seem to think that that's quite a way of gaming the system. That's just, yeah.
Okay, it's not something we monitor. I think it'd be difficult to. Essentially, where we would look at it, or where it comes to Planning Aid's remit, if we had issues that this is sort of causing potential issues and blocking community engagement, then those are the issues where we'd look. But I'll be honest, we haven't had any issues I can think of raised to us of the scenario you just raised as it comes to our desk. You know, I'm assuming you're referring to if a developer's had a refusal, then goes to appeal when he's got the 6-month period. I'm not aware of issues, and I'm not aware of authorities just rolling over and sort of going, oh well, it's late in the day, we can't be bothered. You know, we accept there's a resource issue. But certainly if that was an issue, I think where our concerns would be is if there was sort of issues in the process, not the developer, and I don't know particular applications, and equally it's not my place to say of a developer's approach to things. But if there was a problem that the process was blocking community engagement, that's something we would look at and see, should we be making representations towards government to say, look, you're encouraging community engagement. But at the minute, I've got to admit, it's not a problem that has been highlighted to us.
Thanks. That's perhaps something that might come up in the breakout rooms later when we talk about the challenges and how to tackle the challenges with regards to planning. Time's marching on for us now, so I'm going to hand over to Francis and Mike, who are going to talk to us about Marmalade Lane and their role with town as well. So you're both co-hosts, so if you want to share the screen you can do, but I'll just leave it, I'll just hand over to you now.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start off with a quick presentation, and we'll go fairly quickly so that we can then take questions. So I'm just going to try and share my screen. There should be there, and then excellent. So I'm aiming to take probably about 8 minutes to go through this. I'm not sure if I will succeed. Let's start. This is an image of Orchard Park, which is this sort of 1,000 home development at the edge of Cambridge. This is the A14, and there's quite a busy road along here, and this arrow is showing you Marmalade Lane, and Marmalade Lane is a 42 home intergenerational co-housing scheme that came about as a result of a really innovative partnership between Cambridge City Council, who owned the land, and well, I say it's in partnership. It's innovative procurement by the City Council, and they decided to risk innovation by. So I'm getting derailed a bit, but they took a risk, and they took a risk because in a way they had little other choice at the time. The financial crash meant their mainstream developer for the site had walked away, leaving them with the site still. It was designated for all market sale, and they really were looking for that land receipt. But it was an opportunity for them to rethink, and they decided that they would try and do something different. And they decided they really wanted added value, they wanted something more sustainable, they wanted better quality homes, they wanted a stronger community. Orchard Park was beginning to get a reputation really for as a sort of an example of how not to do urban fringe developments. And they'd been to Vauban in Freiburg, and they were quite inspired by that. And so they started to explore the idea of a group custom build. And in fact, one of the councillors there began to steer it towards co-housing, having a realization that co-housing would probably offer greater social value. And so the outcome is a 42 home intergenerational co-housing community. It's won multiple awards in the 2 years since it was built, including being the overall winner for, I'll get all the initials wrong, but I think it's the Royal Town Planning Institute. Mike, help me out. And most recently, it was the RICS, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors Project of the Year.
I've done both of them.
So despite the council's involvement and support, the process wasn't straightforward. The land was in a different local authority area for a start. So South Cambridgeshire were the planning authority. And we were different and were due to be an exemplar, so we certainly didn't get an easy ride. And innovation always has its own challenges, and one of the things that makes this different to other co-housing communities is this start of the journey, that it's procured by a local authority. There isn't a group that then searches out land. The land led to a group needing to be essentially recruited and to evolve. And the council really was anxious about a group-led development process, and so looked to go down the route of bringing in an enabling developer, which is where town gets involved. So the start of the journey, if I can move the slide on here, is this beginning to a project manager recruited, beginning to recruit potential members, and then beginning to work with them to look at the design for the site in order to go and get outline planning permission. And what you see is the master plan for the site on the left, and on the right are some of the sort of the early thinking of the group in terms of how they saw the site evolving. And one of the things that I would draw your attention to is on the left is really a sort of classic courtyard development. The idea is houses front the streets, and the cars are hidden inside, internally, in these sort of courtyard parking areas. And that isn't what the co-housing group wanted. And what it enabled them to do was to save sort of a tree bank that actually runs across the bottom of the site, and you can see it in the images. But one of the consequences is that their vision put parking along the pavement, essentially. So we'll come back to that point. They put in for outline planning permission, and the aim was to get that before going out to tender for a developer. And in fact, they never succeeded in obtaining that outline planning permission. The car parking was the key issue. It's fairly antisocial location on that street frontage. So if we move on, this is really just summarising really quickly the procurement process that led to town being appointed. But both the City Council and the group were involved in this process. And the outcome was a three-party land sale contract, effectively, with the land price deferred. And the group's client brief and the engagement with the group built into the process. And here is just a quick slide summarising the engagement process with town for the group. You can see that the sort of work streams were split into some key areas, and that really took us through the whole process, including right down to sales and outreach. So town's bid was successful. This is their, on the left is their early tender submission with the design, and it evolved in iteration with both the group and with the planners. And so on the right hand side you can see the community as built, and you can see the parking is now really shuffled entirely to the side. There wasn't capacity to get it all in there, so actually you can see that it overflows into the bottom right hand corner, really sort of visible from the shared garden there. And technically there are parking spaces within the street here, and this is actually Marmalade Lane itself, this internal lane. And so I think from the planning authority's perspective, what they would say is that they learned they needed to be involved earlier in the process before the group's ideas really kind of got quite fixed, and be part of that journey. We did have a meeting with them, the whole group and a number of planners in a workshop format, all kind of trying to find solutions to this parking conundrum. But the outcome is that although Marmalade Lane doesn't fully reflect the master plan, it's not that far away from it. And there, as I indicated, there were challenges, and I think it was important as a potential resident to hold on to the thought that the planners weren't really the enemy, and some of the engagement did result in better outcomes for us. Some are really annoying and didn't, but there had to be compromises all the way along the journey. And I think the design was challenging for them. It challenged some of the established conventions. So for instance, the rear of the lane has the back gardens for some houses and the front gardens for others. So you've got front to back arrangements. That's unusual. It obviously has car parking, it's reduced numbers in comparison to elsewhere, but its location was a critical area of contention. And then I am actually going to stop here. That's another image of the lane from a slightly different angle, and open it up to questions, because I think that's probably more interesting really, and we can get Mike involved as well. So
thanks, Frances. Does anyone have any questions? I don't think anyone's put anything in the chat. But we can open it up.
perhaps while people are thinking, we can just start with Mike just making some observations.
Well, a couple of observations from me then, and I think from the perspective of engaging with the planning process, under a conventional scheme, a developer will often present what they feel that their idealised buyer wants or needs, but when you've got an intentional community, as we did at Marmalade Lane, of course you've got the future residents there, and you're actually able to negotiate and discuss with a group of people who are able to have a much greater say on the future of their community as a result. So, you know, on schemes elsewhere, we're talking about some nuts and boltsy stuff around the planning system, like refuse collection, which can dictate how estates are laid out to meet the needs of a refuse freighter rather than the community that live there. But we're able to make specific demands, specific arrangements for refuse collection that means that we can have a much more intimate and better designed development as a result. So it's just kind of one example, and car parking is a massive one that, as Francis has already pointed to, we're actually just going through an application to take out some of the car parking at Marmalade Lane. We started off with 42 spaces, which is 1 per unit, plus 10 or 11, remind me, Francis, visitor spaces. We're taking, on the basis of some resident surveys and car club and electric car sharing and a whole host of arrangements, we're taking 10 spaces out within 18 months of completion of the development. And that is really quite, it's exciting for us, because we don't like to promote developments that are focused around the needs for the movement and storage of vehicles, but it's fantastic for the community, because they'll have more space to occupy themselves, and for landscaping and trees and all that important stuff. And we're likely to receive delegated approval for that planning application in any day now.
That's great. There is a question from Cara about how the site is multi-generational, and whether there's anything additional there in terms of sheltered accommodation for disabled or elderly people, in terms of making sure that they've got everything that meets their needs as part of the development. I think, have I got that question right, Cara? I don't know if you want to chip in.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Just wondering, yeah, what is the sort of provision for the older or disabled, really, if that's part of it?
So the community very much wanted to achieve a multi-generational community, and have done so, really. I think one of their aims was to meet lifetime home standards, and actually through the design process, the group let go of that objective for some of the smaller properties because of the impact that has on the usable space. So the many homes meet that standard. It is multi-generational. I think the challenge really for the community was, how do you achieve a multi-generational community when Cambridge is so expensive to live in? This fortuitously is a less desirable area, and I think that helped achieve that. But also the design cleverly disguises that on a terrace you go from a 1-bed to a 5-bed, so you've got quite a large range of unit sizes, and even a 1-bed or a 2-bed comes in a range of different sizes for those two. So that was our solution to trying to achieve a multi-generational community, whilst still constrained by the fact that this had to be an all market purchase site.
Brilliant, thank you. There's another question from Catherine as well, about how developers were chosen, really, and was part of it about being eco-build specialists.
Shall I take that?
Yes.
So Town entered the tender process with an investment partner. An investment partner is Tristlehurst UK, which is an off-site modular buildings constructor. It's owned by a Swedish forestry cooperative, partly for an outlet for their goods. So it's basically timber-framed housing, which was brought to site and bolted together, and it means that the housing is close to passive house standards, if anyone's familiar with those. So it's very it's a sustainable development in that sense as well. But so the choice was partly ours when putting the team together and looking at for investors, but clearly that was a big plus tick towards winning the tender as well.
Brilliant, thank you.
I'll put
Casey's
I'll put the answer in the chat.
Thank you. Casey's actually got a question, which is quite a common one for schemes at an early stage, but I can let Casey ask that herself. So.
Thanks, Kay. Yeah, just wondering about sort of the recruitment of members and residents for this project, especially as, you know, like you said, Francis, it wasn't sort of a group coming together and then starting that journey of looking for land. It was more of a sort of a top-down approach. So how did the local authority go about sort of recruiting members?
So it actually thank you. I'm just on Zoom. Sorry about that. I think it predates my involvement, so I'm probably involved just before town gets involved. But my understanding is there wasn't anything really very radical about it. The council managed to get some funding to get that that sort of project going with a project manager. One of his early tasks was really to test whether there was a market for this, whether there were people interested, and he did just put an advert in the local paper, get a bit of editorial coverage, organised some meetings, and people turned up and got excited and began to evolve as a group. And some of the time that took this process was partly because it was so innovative that each stage needed grant funding to get to the point they did. But I think we didn't experience a difficulty in terms of finding people interested. That wasn't a problem at all.
Oh, thank you.
Brilliant.
And I think I was just going to just echo that, actually, just add to that really. I think so many co-housing communities start with the group and then have a very sort of disappointing time struggling to find land over long periods of time, sometimes well over 10 years or more. This approach actually, I think, was a really valuable approach, but at the heart of it was a council willing to take that step and designate the land for co-housing. And the arrangement they chose was really clever. It enabled really them, the developer and the group, each get enough of their needs met for it to work.
That's brilliant, thank you. I'm going to try and keep to time. I can see there's a few other questions, so perhaps we can pick some of those up at the end. And we'll also send a link out to where you can find more information about the scheme as well and about town. But if you don't mind, in order to keep the networking time, the breakout rooms, if we carry on and hand over to Keith Henson. So I think this will cover some of the discussion after Mark's presentation as well. So might answer some of the questions and then we'll break out into our breakout rooms. So Keith, you should be able to share your screen if you want to do that. And
yeah.
Hand over to you.
Just trying to get the, you know, when you think you've got everything prepared, isn't it? I can't find the file at the moment. Bear with me. Just give you a bit of background as I am looking for this particular file. I'm Keith Henson, so Prawn Da, good afternoon to you all. I'm a rural housing enabler who is Gwledig, which is one of a network across Wales, which is part funded by Welsh Government and part funded by the partner funder then, I suppose. So in my instance, I'm actually based at Barcade, which is a recent merger between Tai Ceredigion and Mid Wales housing. So that covers basically Mid Wales. But my role actually covers Ceredigion and the surrounding areas. As Carmarthenshire County Council actually fund part of the role as well, but I'm involved in different projects in Crymych, for example, and also in Machynlleth. Bear with me, I'm having a bit of difficulty finding the file for some reason. So the role of the rural housing enabler, I mean, I know today we're looking at discussing kind of planning issues or involvement within the planning appeal system. But I think it's more than that. It's kind of a bottom-up approach from individuals and communities to make sure that that your voice is heard. Then basically, and sorry, bear with me.
Would it be worth taking one more question while to help keep
yes, please.
Focus on that?
Does anyone have a question?
There's a few more in the chat. There was about the sort of cost and the whether they're on the open, whether there's any for rent, things like that.
But
financial side of it.
The cost, I guess, comparatively, they are of a muchness to those in Cambridge generally. Francis might want to say a little bit more. There are no affordable homes within the scheme, largely because affordable housing has been delivered elsewhere on Orchard Park, and so the local authorities didn't want to have an over-representation of affordable housing, so it is entirely a market sale scheme.
They're probably slightly ahead of the local area, but they are, of course,
on value. Yes, I think
on value,
slightly ahead because, but on cost, they were pretty much of their type. So, in other words, not that people were generally wanting to move away from Marmalade Lane, but it's a good investment financially as well as in social terms. And actually, we were able to provide pretty much a market return for Cambridge City Council as landowner, albeit it was profiled towards the end of the development process, because that means that that helps the developer without having to fork out a significant sum of money early on in the process, early on in the development process.
Brilliant, thank you. That's it's really interesting to hear the sort of different range and so on. I think Keith might be ready now, so we'll hand over.
Thank you. Yeah, apologies for that. All technical difficulties now hopefully resolved, except for some random text in the middle of the slide, but that's not important there. So yeah, as I was saying, the role of the rural housing enabler is actually to work with and on behalf of communities, because it's kind of that middle point between the developer, or as being in the vast majority of the cases, in my particular case, is working with the registered social landlord, the RSL, and the communities. And as Mark mentioned earlier, it's all about getting people around the table and trying to find that kind of halfway house, because quite often you get kind of instances of a lot of NIMBYism, I suppose, isn't it, in terms of looking at things frozen. There we go. So looking at the not in my backyard kind of thing, isn't it? And I think that's the issue in terms around planning quite often. But then I suppose the biggest thing is to make sure that discussions have taken place beforehand. Again, as Mark and Francis and Mike have pointed out as well, in terms of working with the local authority, the local planning authority, to make sure that they understand what you want and you understand what is part of the system. Because obviously within the Welsh Government kind of planning system, you've got various technical advice notices which need to be taken into consideration as well. I mean, specifically in my kind of experience, we're working with TAN 6 and TAN 20 in terms of rural sustainable communities with TAN 6. So you're looking at the rural economy, rural housing, rural services, and rural agriculture, and all of them need to be sustainable, of course. So it's making sure that the local planning authority understand what you're trying to put in place for that, I suppose. But also specifically in kind of areas such as Ceredigion, for example, Gwynedd, North Pembrokeshire, vast parts of Carmarthenshire as well, in terms of looking at TAN 20 and then Welsh language. And make sure that that's taken into consideration as well when you're applying for planning. And I think one of the biggest issues that that I've seen in terms of when attending the development control meetings within Ceredigion is the fact that the planning system seems to be very much kind of urban centric, as opposed to looking at rural aspects and not taking into account perhaps some of the planning applications that are going in, which make perfect sense in terms of what's needed, where, etc. But of course, because it doesn't fit into kind of a model that's outlined by the Welsh Government, it's a bit more difficult for the local planning authority and the local councillors to take into account. I think one of the key things I've seen in terms of when things happen prior to them going on to appeal is the discussions that have not taken place. So I think it's vital, and apologies again for the kind of rudimentary slides, but it's about talking to your local councillor, talking to the planning department, looking at the guidance. I mean, and I know that's difficult because there's so much guidance out there. One of the key things is attending some of the development meetings before putting in the applications perhaps, because you get a feel in terms of what's going on, how they deal with things, and the kind of the language and the acronyms, etc., that is being discussed. And obviously since March, the development meetings have been virtually, and in Ceredigon's case, for example, you've got to be contacting the Democratic Control Unit to request access to the meeting via Zoom, and that's pretty straightforward. One of the differences, the biggest differences I've seen from these development control meetings now is that when people who would have normally spoken, I suppose, in front of the councillors to express their point of view as to why they would believe the planning should be agreed, or if somebody's objecting, is that of course you can't do it in person. It's got to be written and sent on, and then they read it out, which you do lose that kind of personal touch and the emotional side to it as well. But of course, local planners, it's all based on fact. It's black and white, and it's got to be there. But I think it's important that you do attend these in terms of seeing how they deal with matters. And for example, now within, again, and Ceredigion is the example because that's where I'm based, obviously. They've had a number of applications which have been called in by the planning inspectorate because they've gone against the planning officer's advice. That is, the local councils have gone against the local planning advice. And I think that's one of the key things at the moment, that the councillors are quite sceptical in terms of what they go against in terms of looking at the rural aspect of it. So I think it's all about having those discussions and making sure that that they understand what's going on and that you understand what's going on. But there's a definite difference at the moment between kind of the rural aspect and the urban aspect, and of course in a country such as Ceredigion, which was obviously one of the lowest cases of coronavirus up to about 3 weeks ago, whereas now we're probably one of the worst, is we haven't got many urban areas. It is very rural, small villages, etc. And in a lot of those areas, the allocations for the LDPs have already been exceeded. So that's quite a challenge again at the moment. I mean, this is an example of the Development Control Committee. Next one now is in December. This one's back in November. They tend to come out a couple of weeks before the meeting. Quite useful to have a look at what's going on there, in terms of the agenda. You can see pretty straightforward, but also it'll show you what kind of appeals that there are going on as well. If there are any appeal decisions, in the last meeting there weren't any. Obviously things have slowed down, I suppose, to a degree because of COVID, etc. This is an example of an appeal that's gone in because somebody's appealing against the refusal of planning permission. Shows you where. Then you've got to troll back then, I suppose, to the interactive search facility on the local authority's website. You'll see the appeal reference, you'll see the application number there, third column wrong, and you can see what's being applied for, etc. You will see it in terms of the meeting, because when they do discuss it, it's always useful to have kind of background information in terms of what's going on. This goes back to July, when there was another appeal decision that had gone in. There's quite a few there actually, because again they were playing catch up. It just shows you what the reason and the grounds for something to be approved, I suppose. Then there's that kind of thing in terms of number 5 there, appeals received. That's been called in by Planning Inspectorate Wales, and since then I think they've called in another 4 from Ceredigion, because they've requested minutes from previous agendas just to see why and how they've gone against the local planning authority's advice. So it's quite interesting in terms of seeing things, and I know these because I've been working with them in terms of trying to identify what kind of things they can be looking at in terms of the technical advice notices, etc. Getting support from neighbours, and also looking at the TAN 20 as well, I suppose, in terms of the Welsh language issue, because they are a local couple, etc. But quite often, of course, some of the ones who want to plan to build and apply for planning in open countryside may be ones who've been gifted land, which is not quite the same issue as perhaps where we need to make sure that local people are able to stay local, because they've been priced out of the market. So it's all about having those discussions and making sure that you can get buy-in from the local planning authority, because of course they have to follow what's in the guidance, and also having conversations with the local councillors. Examples of, again, appeal decisions. There's quite a lengthy note that comes out from the Planning Inspectorate that they follow the relevant and appropriate guidance there. Again, all available online, ideally through the local authority website, but they are available through Welsh Government links as well. So that's basically, in a nutshell, but also in terms of looking at how RSLs want to apply for planning, because within, for example, Barkir at the moment, there's a development team, and they are looking at using some innovative housing programme funding from Welsh Government to build some one-bedroom flats, for example, in Aberystwyth. And that will be proposed for planning, of course. It is an infill site. Interesting to see what comes out of that. I'm not actually working in that particular community. It'll be interesting to see how that's taken forward because of where it's located, etc. But again, it's having those conversations, I suppose.
That's great, thanks, Keith. I think there was some really useful information in there about who people need to be talking to when they're looking at the process to get planning permission through, and also information that it can be good to collate and have to hand to perhaps preempt some of the things that happen at appeals or when developments get objected to. As time's marching on, I'm gonna, because I think that leads really nicely into the challenges that people face, I'm gonna launch the breakout rooms. And And one of the question that we were hoping that you could consider in the breakout rooms is really about what the big planning challenges are facing community-led housing groups. And I think we know that no group is unique at all. But in some cases, those challenges could be quite common, and what we might do as a programme and others to help you better understand how to tackle these challenges. So if you give me a few seconds to launch the breakout rooms, and seeing how time goes, perhaps if you wanted to nominate someone within your group to feedback at the end, and we can possibly pick up any questions. But of course, the team's always available, and we'll make sure you have our details just to pick up any questions afterwards as well. So hopefully this will all go to plan, and you'll have a message coming out asking you to join a breakout room. So bear with me and have a look.
Can somebody put the question in the chat as well, please? Because I didn't completely catch it.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll launch the breakout rooms, and that chat will still be there, so we'll pick it up after people have had the breakout sessions, if that's okay. So hopefully this will work. There you go, you should have the invite now. There you go, I think we've got everyone back in now. I know there was a question just before we broke out into groups, so we've got a couple of minutes before our scheduled end of today's network. So does anyone want to raise any questions with regards to Keith's presentation, or would you prefer to feedback on the issues that you've discussed? Hi, Jacqueline.
Hi, we had a fairly robust conversation. Unfortunately Eleanor, our lady who was scribing for us, actually has written down stuff to feedback and didn't have enough chance to chat. And was really interested in the things that she was just highlighting, the things that we didn't actually know or understand. So some of that's been brought to the fore today. So thank you for that. But I think it would be nice if we could feed those things back, if she was allowed to.
Yeah, definitely. What I'll do is when we send out the recording and our usual request for feedback, we'll give everyone an opportunity to feed in, and if everyone's willing, we can share contact details as well. So if you don't want to do that, then you can let us know. I can see that Francis and Mike have had to leave, so I just want to quickly say a really massive thank you. It was really interesting to hear about Marmalade Lane and the role Town had in that as well. I think for me it's just really obvious what a big topic it is, and we can't cover so much of it in an hour and a half today. Does anyone want to raise anything else before we all go and eat our lunch and so on and get on with the rest of our days? No, we've worn you all out with...
Eleanor had her hand up. Eleanor had her hand up.
Okay, hi Eleanor.
Hi. Oh, well, I just wanted to say I need to get in touch with Cara and with Cara Wilson and Chris Thomas, because there's things happening in my area, and I'm struggling on my own, and I just didn't know what was happening. So there needs to be more communication, and so I look forward to being in touch.
Yeah, definitely. We can
do that, Ellie. Could I, well, adding to that, I'm really happy to do that, Ellie. I was going to say, can we share email contacts from the group if people are happy to do that, to sort of help networking? And maybe this, your project could facilitate maybe breakout networking, by county or something, so that people can, I can see people I know are from Pembrokeshire, but there may be more that I haven't met yet. And it'd be really handy and strengthen our cause if we can meet and talk to each other. If you could facilitate that somehow, that would be great.
Yeah, that's something discussed as a team before. So I think it's definitely something that that we need to act on now. There's obviously an appetite for that. So definitely get some regional networks. We used to do them face to face, funnily enough, and then obviously with COVID coming in, that's changed a little bit. But we can
maybe you could leave this line open and send people into sort of requested rooms by request after the formal session.
Yeah, definitely. That's really useful feedback that we can act on. If no one else has any questions, I'm going to let you all escape now and carry on with your day. What we'll do is I'll share the chat as well, so I'll save that and you can see some of the things in there, and we'll have a look through and see if there's any questions that we can address too. But certainly we'll share the email contacts if there's no objections to that, and get the recording out to you as soon as possible. I know it's been quite a heavy going one today. And just to say thank you to our speakers as well. It's been really great to have you contributing, and it was all really, really useful. But I'll let you all escape now and carry on with your day.
Just briefly before we go, just to say that the next session, the next network will be, I think, on December the 17th, and we'll be doing a special Communities Creating Christmas network event, where we'll be inviting people to bring along gifts that they can give on Zoom. So think about that, and please do come back with those, and we'll obviously send out mailing about that. Thanks, Claire. Sorry to...
That's okay, that's fine, that's brilliant. So I'll let everyone go. I can see that Cara's